Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Brownfield today. Headlines have been circling around Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and there are a lot of questions about what's going on in the Black Sea region and how some of that could impact U.S. farmers and agribusinesses. Today, Greg Dowd joins me to kind of assess the situation and hopefully answer some of those questions. You might recognize Greg from his past role as chief ag negotiator for the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. He played a critical role in the development of the Phase 1 trade agreement with China. And currently, he is the vice president of global situational awareness and a chief economist for Aimpoint Research. Greg, I'll let you go ahead and tell us what you're doing in your current role.
Well, this is a really unique company, Aimpoint Research, based in Columbus, Ohio. My colleagues are military, and in fact, the founder of the company and two colonels that came from the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, they were classmates at West Point together. And so we do about 4 different things here at Aimpoint. We do really excellent market research, and so we do a lot of work with clients and agriculture companies and trade associations with their customers and clients on how things are evolving in agriculture. We do a lot of strategic planning and thinking. We do the wargaming, which is very unique to us, as we've taken the military wargame business model to corporate America, and we have a lot of colleagues busy doing that. But to go into all of that takes an enormous amount of intelligence of what's going on in agriculture, not only all around the world in the commodity business, but in terms of new technologies, new investments, new innovations, new thinking in agriculture. We spend an enormous amount of time on that as well. So that if we put all these things together, it's a pretty innovative business model, and it's actually a lot of fun.
Very good to hear that you're enjoying that, Greg. Before we go any further, I want our listeners to kind of know how fluid this situation is. Things are constantly changing. And, what we talk about today might not even be a conversation starter tomorrow. Greg has been watching the situation pretty closely, and he's going to give us his professional insight today. But just knowing that things could very easily change. So with that being said, kind of less than 48 hours since Russia's initial attack on Ukraine, a lot to follow and not a lot of time to process. To kind of kick things off, Greg, can you explain or summarize just what this dispute is over and why this is happening?
Well, I think that's a really good question to start out with, and it's difficult to get in the head of Vladimir Putin and understand what motivates him. It seems to be simply the fact that he doesn't like the idea of having a democracy in the Ukraine on his border. He feels like that it's been long overdue time to reestablish the USSR the way it used to be. And so he's clearly been mapping this out for a long time, as he's been mapping out, Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea. This isn't like a one-off. He's been thinking about this for many, many years, and he's decided to pull the trigger at this time on this. And for us in agriculture, we have to really just stop for a minute and rather than go to big extremes, and it means that it's going to be this or that for the wheat market or this or that for the corn market. I think we just have to stop right now, at least, and see what's happening day to day to day. And here's to the best of my understanding is that in the port of Odessa in the Ukraine on the Black Sea, they have most of the majors have long-standing facilities where, in the case of the Ukraine, a lot of corn comes out of the Ukraine for export, and the primary destination for that is typically China. And so you have ADM, Bunge, Cargill, Louis Dreyfus all have facilities there. And my understanding is the day before yesterday, things were relatively normal. And as of yesterday, it's all stopped. And so we have to, on a day-to-day basis, how much trade is being displaced and where does it go if that demand for corn, if it's not coming from the Ukraine, I think you just have to measure it on a day-to-day incremental basis. And that's a hard thing to know and do at this moment in time. The other thing is that you see, there was one vessel that was attacked yesterday by Russian forces that was involved grain, and it's going to be interesting to see how much more of that disruption you see in terms of navigating the Black Sea, and how many vessel owners of ocean-going vessels are going to be willing to go into those waters at this time, and how long is all of that going to last from a naval standpoint, has a big impact. And then on the Russian side of the equation, when you look at wheat, if you take Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan together, and I like to add Kazakhstan in there just because it's minor, but it's the same part of the world. That's about 32.5, or plus or minus a third of all the wheat traded in the world comes through those waters. And so that's a big deal for wheat. And we have to keep a close eye on this over time as to see what the disruption is. And not only does this have a big impact for the exporters on the side of the equation, the biggest place that wheat goes, the biggest wheat importer in the world is Egypt. And this, if you begin to disrupt, food supplies in the Middle East, that's going to have a pretty serious implication as well.
Well, you touched on a lot of different grains there, and that's where I kind of want to go next. Is, it's obvious that the markets are reacting in various ways. What are we seeing there so far on the grain market side, or what can we be keeping an eye on as this moves forward?
Well, I think that's also a topic where what we say today is going to be relevant tomorrow. My goodness, the ag commodities have been on a run here so far this year. And I think there was a sentiment here in the last few days that whatever euphemism you want to use, this thing was out over its skis, it was overdone. Technically, it was due for a correction. I think all of those things were pretty accurate. And today we're certainly seeing that. A little bit of a correction here in these markets. Not surprised at all to see that. And I think, what to me is the issue that I've been talking about, and I've been out giving speeches and at meetings every week so far this year, is really communicating the notion of extreme volatility in these markets. World stocks to use ratios are tight or record tight, wheat, corn, and soybeans. You've got a lot of volatile dynamics going on in China. And of course, China is the biggest importer of corn, biggest importer of soybeans, biggest importer of beef, biggest importer of pork, one of the biggest in wheat. They drive the bus here. And China's pretty volatile and pretty choppy right now in its own right, economically, and with prices of pork in China and soybean crushing margins being all over the board over there, makes it really hard on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis to kind of get your bearings.
Speaking of volatility, we bring up ag inputs next. Those have been top of mind for our U.S. farmers for several months, and fertilizer markets and prices also jumped up overnight on Wednesday, mainly because of how much of that actually comes out of the Black Sea region. What can we be following there, Greg?
I think that's also exactly right, and hard to understand what that does from day to day, other than increase the volatility of the situation. I think in the discussions that I've been a part of and the presentations that I've seen, and I am certainly no expert in fertilizer, but what is remarkable to me is from a Kansas farm boy perspective, whether you have urea or liquid or anhydrous or whatever it is, the supply and demand of each one of these different types of fertilizers, the fundamental issues going into the production of each one of these is unique. It's different. And so you just can't say, well, generally speaking, fertilizer is going to do this because it may be, going one direction for one thing and a different direction for another here. And the logistics of all of these, from a transportation standpoint, cost of transportation, it's a really, really complex and complicated thing to understand. And I think equally, different parts of the country in the United States use different types of fertilizer. In Iowa, you can use a lot more anhydrous versus in the Mississippi Delta, you just simply can't. So I think all of these different dynamics going into to explaining to you, I don't know the answer to where volatility is headed on fertilizer. And I think, but it is a huge, huge factor this year, not only on the fertilizer side of the equation, but also on the glyphosate side of the equation as well. And I think one of the big things that we've known since last summer is that you've had blackouts in Chinese provinces where they make some of the raw materials that go into making glyphosate. And when you shut down those factories last summer, that has a huge ripple effect all the way through the supply chain for months in advance. If you don't have the ingredients, you can't make the finished product at the end of the day. And that's what's been happening as well.
You mentioned logistics and, availability of those fertilizers and some of the other products that come out of that region were already kind of a concern before this attack. Explain what that looks like in terms of logistics, being able to get things in and out of that region. Is that going to stop?
Well, I think I don't know all the details and exact specifications of the different commodities, but I will tell you this generally speaking, if it's being carried on a bulk carrier, such as wheat, corn, or soybeans, things are pretty good. We don't have a lot of backlog and delay in that area. Most folks will tell you that we're managing all of that pretty well. Now, I don't know all the details of where we're at on the barges on the Mississippi right now, but I don't know of any huge disruption on the bulk side of the equation. Where the disruption continues to be the case is when you're dealing with containers. And I think, that is a function of supply and demand, a lot of U.S. supply, a lot of backlog in producing things in China, COVID related, electricity blackout related, et cetera, both here and in China. And the extreme demand for empty containers going back to China, empty on the backhaul. Prices for those are much higher than being able to utilize those containers for agricultural exports and agricultural commodity trade on the backhaul. It's hard. There's been a lot of talk about this. You go out to Tacoma, Washington, 80% of what goes in that container on the backhaul back to Asia is an agricultural product. And if those containers go back empty, that's costing us ag export business. And I don't know how to quantify that, but that's so. Not only are these logistic issues on the container side an issue on the input side, they're also an issue for our ability to move products out of this country as well.
Continuing kind of along the lines of those inputs, we're hearing a lot about what could happen with Russian oil and natural gas distribution. How does that affect the U.S.?
Well, I think it affects the U.S. differently today than it did a year or two ago, in the fact that we did have energy independence here for a while, and now we're in a situation where we're importing more oil from Russia than we had in the past. How quickly you're able to get some of the fracking and different production mechanisms in the U.S. back online. Obviously, we've touched $100 a barrel oil here, but we've got a lot of volatility in the oil market as well. I think you've got some incentives here to drive some domestic production back online here. How long that takes to do that, I don't know the answer to that.
There's a lot of uncertainty again here about how the administration and other countries will respond in terms of global trade with Russia and Ukraine moving forward. Can you walk us through what some of the options might be there and the potential impacts on U.S. ag, depending on what those countries decide to do?
Yeah, I think so. Let's bite this off in pieces. I think the first and important thing to understand is, from a U.S. agricultural export standpoint, Russia just isn't a big deal. Historically, it used to be a big deal for us in wheat when they were an importer. We used to sell them quite a bit of poultry on and off historically, but today we just haven't had a lot of success exporting agricultural products to Russia. And so it's not like we're losing any great market here. The issue is in terms of the fact that the Black Sea now provides roughly 1/3 of the world's wheat that's traded on the world market. And the dynamic of how much of that supply is going to be available. Another important aspect of wheat that is very important to understand is that Vladimir Putin right now has a $95 a ton, $2.60 a bushel tax on every bushel or every ton of wheat coming out of Russia. He's taxing Russian wheat exports because he is very concerned, and has been for some time. This has been going on since last summer. He started out at $10 or $20 a ton, and then it's ratcheted all the way up now to $95 a ton. He didn't want European exporters to over-export the Russian wheat crop and leave Russian consumers and jack up bread prices in Russia. So he taxed Russian wheat exports. What's interesting about that now is if you look at the Russian wheat crop coming on for this year, early indications would suggest that it looks like a pretty good crop. He might have a pretty good wheat crop coming. And if he makes a decision to say just eliminate that $95 a ton tax, that's a penny for penny, dollar for dollar will bring down world wheat prices. And so I think there's that, to me, is probably the biggest implication for agricultural commodities, and in particular the wheat market at the moment, is to see in the next 3 to 6 months what he might decide to do with that Russian wheat export tax.
Right. And wheat's something we're going to be watching closely those next 3 to 6 months anyway, with the winter wheat crop in the ground here in the U.S. and having some drought impacts in a lot of those areas too.
No question. The biggest topic from a Kansas farm perspective, where I'm from, is this La Nina and the fact that it continues, and the notion that we thought was going to kind of die out on us here this spring or by early summer. And now we kind of see from all these indications in the Pacific Ocean, et cetera, that this thing may linger and hang with us through the rest of the year. If that's the case, man, this makes me nervous. I just don't like the setup here in terms of the moisture situation, particularly down the middle of the country, the Dakotas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas.
Definitely something to watch and keep in mind there. Greg, to kind of maybe summarize and close us out, for our U.S. farmers, ranchers, ag businesses, can you kind of give us some of the top items that they should be keeping in mind right now when following this Russia-Ukraine situation?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm following. And that is, I'm watching China very closely, because they are just the biggest player on the block in agriculture these days across the board. And what we see in China is really hard to gauge, because you saw fourth quarter GDP growth in China at only 4%. That's a disaster for them. Normally it's 8%, 7 or 8 is kind of what they've been running at. And so at these higher commodity prices, are the Chinese consumers, are consumers in places like Central America or Mexico or Vietnam or the Philippines or Indonesia going to be able to hang in there with their disposable incomes to purchase food at these higher commodity prices? This is really going to be something to watch here in 2022. If they are able to hang in here, is at these prices and as tight as everything is, and we're able to, even though we have a shorter crop in Brazil on soybeans, the U.S. is able to hang in there, and our ag exports hang where they are. We had a record year last year. If we can hold where we are right now and maintain this at these levels, that really speaks well to where we can go in the future in terms of supply and demand globally and ag commodity prices. So we've got to watch and see amongst these consumers, the middle-class consumers globally, at food inflation and these higher prices, can they hang in there? That's the telltale sign that we're watching.
All right, Greg, do you have anything else you want to add at this time on this situation that I haven't asked about?
I think we've kind of covered. Hopefully this was good for you.
Definitely. Well, I appreciate your time and expertise, Greg. I'll plan to be in touch with you later next week for maybe an update on developments in the Black Sea region and some of the topics that we touched on today. In the meantime, listeners can follow Ag News coverage of the Russia-Ukraine dispute at brownfieldagnews.com. You can also follow us, Brownfield, at Brownfield on Facebook and